Zhong Changyu resigned from his employment as an engineer at ASML in 2012, which is the only firm in the world capable of producing this device. This machine produces the world's most sophisticated semiconductor chips or microchips. After leaving ASML, he founded two new businesses, one in the United States and one in China. Later, US and ASML attorneys would claim that Yu hired additional ASML engineers for his US business, that they carried stolen knowledge on AMSL's equipment with them, and that the Chinese government was behind it all. This is only a small part of China's massive endeavor to alter one of the world's most global and vital industries, semiconductors. However, China's efforts have progressively ensnared it in a conflict with the United States. It's not about market share here. It's not about tariffs. This is about safety. So, how did China and the United States become embroiled in a Cold War over computer chips? Hello and welcome to Economic News. Before we answer the question, please like the video and subscribe with all notifications turned on, since that is the best way to show your love and support for the videos we share. Thank you, and let us get back into the video. The first semiconductor chip was created in the 1950s by engineers in the United States. It's a silicon chip with 4 transistors on it. The greater the number of transistors, the more powerful the chip. Engineers had already created one with 4 times the transistors by 1960. Each year, they found new methods to expand. As a result, semiconductors have advanced at an exponential rate since the early 1960s. Chris Miller is the author of Chip War. Gordon Moore, the creator of Intel, projected in 1965 that the computer power supplied by a single chip would double every year or so, and that the rate has generally stayed true up to the present. The earliest chip-making enterprises were established in the United States, where they primarily served one customer, the United States government. The initial applications were in guiding computers on NASA's spacecraft and in the missile system.
Cases were actually in guidance computers that were in NASA spacecraft as well as in missile system.
The US government assumed that a close collaboration with chip firms would ensure that it always had access to the latest advanced processors. The US administration has long recognized that computers are a key predictor of a nation's influence on the global arena. Consider how computers were used to decipher codes during World War II or to detect Soviet submarines during the Cold War. That assessment, I believe, is true. Initially, these chip corporations were in charge of the whole supply chain. They created the chips, produced them, and packaged them for inclusion in a product, all within the United States. However, by the late 1960s, they discovered they could earn much more money building semiconductors for civilian devices, such as business computers. They just needed to produce a lot more of them at a lower cost. As a result, several chip companies relocated their production and assembly to lower labor markets such as Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. And the US government backed them up. All of these nations were friends or partners of the United States, and this was a method to help their economy and strengthen connections. Simultaneously, it prohibited these chip businesses from sharing technology with its adversaries, the Soviet Union and China. It was a strategy to keep them years behind the US as chip technology evolved. Because of Moore's law, modern processors outperform prior versions significantly. You're actually fairly far behind the cutting edge if you're 5 or 10 years behind. But it didn't take long for these allied countries to start investing in their own semiconductor businesses. Toshiba in Japan and Samsung in South Korea began creating and producing semiconductors that competed with the Americans in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1990s, a Taiwanese company, TSMC, became so adept at chip fabrication that many US corporations ceased doing it. It meant that American businesses were no longer the only ones capable of producing the most sophisticated semiconductors. Furthermore, each country's chip sector was becoming increasingly dependent on other countries for the materials, software, and equipment required to manufacture more complicated devices. But as the United States and its allies were pushing the boundaries of semiconductor technology, China had fallen behind. In addition to the US preventing it from getting chips during the Cold War, the tyrant Mao Zedong drove many of China's top scientists and engineers out of the nation throughout the 1960s and 1970s. However, new Chinese leaders strove to catch up during the next few decades. The Cold War ended by the 1990s. The US had gotten friendlier with China, and most of its export limits had been abolished. As a result, China encouraged numerous semiconductor makers to relocate their assembly operations there. By the 2000s, China had taken over this end of the supply chain. However, China was importing an increasing amount of chips to feed its assembly business, putting them in a difficult situation. The Chinese government had researched the tech supply chain and discovered that the whole Chinese tech ecosystem was built on imported silicon from China's geopolitical foes, including the United States, Japan, and Taiwan. And rightly, China's leaders judged that this was a risk they were hesitant to continue taking. As a result, the Chinese government invested heavily in its own chip design and production firms, which was increasingly collaborating with non-Chinese enterprises, all in the interests of establishing a fully Chinese semiconductor supply chain. China will soon be able to design, produce, and assemble some earlier generations of chips entirely on its own. However, it was still many years away from producing the most cutting-edge chips. One of those chips is this. It has around 114 billion transistors. Remember how many chips there were in 1960? Computing powers like those of the past will be employed for military purposes in the future. The difficulty is that only a few businesses in the world make them, and none of them are in China. To begin, just 3 American businesses produce the software required to create sophisticated processors. Then, to transform those ideas into actual chips, a machine produced by just one firm is required, ASML. However, this machine requires equipment that is solely manufactured in the United States. Finally, only Taiwanese and South Korean businesses can put it all together and build the most powerful CPU chips. These businesses are bottlenecks in the supply chain. China was completely dependent on them for sophisticated semiconductors. In 2019, authorities in the United States attempt to arrest Zhongchang Yu, but were unable to locate him until he reappeared later in China as the CEO of his firm, which produced successful software similar to ASML's. His business was thriving thanks to assistance from the Chinese government, and this was only one of countless cases of intellectual property theft in the semiconductor sector, because the Chinese government recognizes that its enterprises are in a position of relative vulnerability. The Chinese government has been at best passively sympathetic, and in some cases, actively encouraging of IP theft. China was identifying and imitating choke spots like ASML in order to gradually reduce its reliance on this international supply chain. However, the scheme backfired, and this has enraged the US administration and other nations, prompting them to view China's subsidies as a security concern rather than an economic one. This was happening at the same time as the US-China relationship was growing less friendly and more competitive.
For many years, China has been taking out hundreds of billions of dollars a year and rebuilding China. It's time that we rebuild our country. 20 years has been taking hundreds of billions of dollars out of our country. So now it's time that we change things around. If they don't want to trade with us anymore, that would be fine with me.
The Trump government prohibited US corporations from providing components to ZTE, a Chinese technology company, in 2018. Then in 2019, it prohibited US corporations from doing business with Huawei and its affiliates, China's largest technology giant. These sanctions nearly brought ZTE to its knees and caused a severe blow to Huawei. Joe Biden, the next president, attacked China's semiconductor sector more generally in 2022. It first prohibited all US businesses from supplying sophisticated chips to China, but it also prohibited Chinese design firms from utilizing US-made design software and production equipment. Furthermore, it prohibits worldwide businesses that leveraged US semiconductor technology from supplying advanced chips to China. The United States was using these choke spots to halt China's semiconductor sector. These export limitations reflected a clear move away from the belief that eventually trade and tax exchanges with China were inherently positive sum games, and toward a far more negative sum view of technology competitiveness. The United States then approved legislation to invest billions of dollars in its own chip manufacturing businesses, and has reached an agreement with Taiwan's largest manufacturer, TSMC, to develop production operations in the United States, all in order for the United States to maintain its lead. When it comes to semiconductors, China and the United States have a similar perspective on the political stakes. That is why the US administration has made defending the US lead a top priority. However, this has put enormous strain on another disagreement between the two countries. China has regarded Taiwan as a separatist province and has threatened to reconnect with it, even threatening invasion, since 1949. The United States has sworn to defend Taiwan. However, Taiwan also owns the most crucial choke point in the semiconductor supply chain. Taiwanese firms produce 63% of all chips and about 92% of all sophisticated chips. Taiwan has established some protection for itself by having firms that are essential to both the US and Chinese semiconductor sectors. However, US export limitations oblige Taiwanese enterprises to choose between defying the US and continuing to sell to China, may cooperate and deny China access to certain of its chips. So far, they've indicated that they'll cut off China. However, as China and the United States dispute over chips, more and more options like these will be forced on governments and businesses throughout the world, asking people to choose sides in what appears to be a new Cold War. Thank you for watching this video. Leave a comment down below if you think China will go as far as a full-on invasion on Taiwanese grounds in order to take over the microchip industry, or will this be very similar to the Cold War the US experienced with the USSR just a couple of decades ago? Take care now and have a great day.